Video games have been around for several decades and have grown to become a normal occurrence in everyday life. People of both genders from childhood into adulthood spend countless hours playing video games in today's culture. This form of entertainment is global in that people play online video games with others around the World Wide Web. According to Statista, a statistics portal, in 2016, there were 912 million gamers in Asia Pacific, 600 million gamers in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and 200 million gamers in North America. So about the violent aspects of video games. With the recent school shootings in Parkland, Florida on Valentine's Day in 2018, there is continued debate on whether violent video games cause a gamer to act out aggressively based on the video game experience. The purpose of this essay is to find out if there is a direct link between playing violent video games in a fantasy world and acting out in a violent manner in the real world. This video essay will review studies to find if there exists a connection between playing violent video games and performing a violent act. The proposed hypothesis is that there is no evidence to find a direct link found between violent video games and acts of violence. Rather, violent video games may be a subtle predictor and not the sole causal factor that leads to violent acts. This discussion will also consider some of the positive effects of games playing as learning tools for emotional and educational development and support. This video essay will attempt to contribute in minimizing the possible dangers and maximizing the advantages of video games. Considering recent school shootings, many political leaders are quick to blame violent video games as the cause of these tragedies. It's important to continue this conversation since video games will most likely remain a common ingredient today. Let's look at what do we mean by the term video games. Nicolas Esposito from the University of Technology of Compiègne, France, says that a video game is a game which we play thanks to an audiovisual apparatus and which can be based on a story. He said this definition is based on well-known thoughts about game, play, interactivity, and narrative. He explains that a video game is a game or a competition with a goal in mind. It is a form of playing and interacting with other players and may be based on a story or scenario. Video games are not only played on personal computers, but also must be played on a console or arcade machine. And Maria Chesley-Fisk, Deputy Director of Health Game Research, said violent video games are those that represent violence as the best and only way to resolve conflict. We see some of these examples from games including Grand Theft Auto, Soldier of Fortune, and Halo. Let's take a brief look at the history of violence in video games. According to Thomas A. Koojmans of the Rochester Institute of Technology, the first of popular games to be considered containing violent behavior for its time was Pac-Man in 1980. This game involved eating ghosts or being captured and dissolved into nothing by the ghost. Koojmans said when Super Mario Bros. Was released in the 1980s, it was also considered violent because the main character broke blocks and tried to destroy the enemies by jumping on their heads. By today's standards, these two games are nothing when it comes to violent video games. A new generation of violent video games appeared in the 1990s with more lifelike graphics and capabilities for violence and gore. These games include Doom, Quake, and Mortal Kombat. Since 2000, improvements in technology have provided even more realistic violent video games. Today in 2018, popular video games that display violent acts include the Call of Duty series and Wolfenstein: The New Order. In the past 2 decades, research studies have been unsuccessful in finding a direct link between playing violent video games and participating in violent acts. Studies in the early 21st century found a relationship between aggressive behavior and violent video games. In 2001, researchers Craig Anderson and Brad Bushman conducted a review of the video game research literature that revealed violent video games increased aggressive behavior in children and young adults. They said that exposure to these violent video games also increased physiological arousal along with aggression-related thoughts and feelings. In their article, Effects of Violent Video Games on Aggressive Behavior, Aggressive Cognition, Aggressive Affect, Physiological Arousal, and Prosocial Behavior, a meta-analytic review of the scientific literature. Anderson and Bushman said the results support the hypothesis that exposure to violent video games posed a public health threat to children and youth, including college-age people, because they said exposure was positively associated with increased levels of aggression and exposure was negatively associated with prosocial behavior. While these studies found an association between aggressive behavior and violent video games, there was no conclusion found that real-world violence will result from playing these video games, and no further explanation was given to identify what particular health threat would occur as a result of playing these games. Another study in 2005 examined 10 minutes of play from 60 of the most popular video games of 1999. The goal was to look at aggressive, violent characters to assess what possible threat they may be posed based on demographic considerations for similarity and for character attractiveness. This study by Kenneth Lachlan, Stacy Smith, and Ron Tamburini said there existed a wide range of aggressive role models in violent video games which presented physical aggression in such a way that increased the risk of learning aggression in different ways to different audiences. The results shown that violent game characters had attributes that were likely to increase the extent to which some video game players perceived them as similar and attractive. It is interesting to note that among the list of games examined for this study were Disney's Toy Story, Frogger, Super Mario 64, and Mario Party. The more violent games on the list were Resident Evil 3, GoldenEye 007, and Ready to Rumble Boxing. These are just a few of many research studies that found playing violent video games can create more aggressive behavior, such as bullying and fighting, along with aggressive thoughts and feelings in both males and females. It is important to point out that not all aggressive behaviors and thoughts are violent in nature, and these studies have not found a direct connection between violent video games playing and acting out in a violent nature. Other researchers in recent years have argued against popular opinion that violent video games are harmful. One of the most notable researchers is Dr. Christopher Ferguson, a psychology professor at Texas A&M International University. In several studies, Ferguson said there was no clear evidence to support the argument that violent video games cause any violence today. And media scholar Henry Jenkins, who is a provost professor of communication, journalism, cinematic arts and education at the University of Southern California, claims that the majority of young gamers do not commit antisocial acts as a result of playing video games with violent content. In his article, Reality Bites, 8 Myths About Video Games Debunked, which can be found on www.pbs.org, Jenkins says researchers have found criminals who are serving time in prison for violent acts generally consume less media before committing their crimes than the average person. He further cites a U.S. Surgeon General reports in 2001 that concluded the strongest risk factor for school shootings focused on mental stability and the quality of home life, not on media exposure. From these studies, it is difficult to accept the argument that violent video games serve as a single independent risk factor for performing violent acts. Other researchers have contested that there is no clear connection between violent video games and violence, saying that the offenders have personality traits that predispose them to commit violent acts. Dr. Patrick Markey of Villanova University and Dr. Charlotte Markey of Rutgers University found that some individuals who were adversely affected by violent video games had pre-existing personality traits that made them susceptible to the violent games. In a report by Lauren Goldbeck and Lex Pugh of the National Center for Health Research, they pointed out that violent video games exposure is only one factor, suggesting that other factors to consider include mental illness, adverse environments, and access to firearms. Goldbeck and Pugh said it remains unclear whether violent video game playing is linked to any criminal acts. So, with no evidence currently available to link violent video games to violent acts, this discussion needs to stop and take another direction. Given the continual popularity of video games, it appears that this medium needs to be taken a more positive and productive direction. In a recent article dated February 16, 2018, in The Conversation, Ferguson calls for an end to the debate about video games and violence. He said, "Any claims that there is consistent evidence that violent video games encourage aggression are simply false. He said research has shown that the increase in violent video game popularity correlates with declines in youth violence, suggesting these games' releases may cause the decline in actual violent acts. Media scholar Henry Jenkins also proposed a shift in the rethinking of video game violence debate by focusing on a meanings model to determine what meanings players take from playing video games. He says that games are designed to be played successfully by players with different goals and skill sets. In the article, The War Between Effects and Meaning, Rethinking the Video Game Violence Debate, Jenkins admits that games do represent powerful tools for learning if we see learning in a more meaning-driven sense. He says this shift in thinking will help identify some educational interventions to develop skills and vocabulary needed for video game players to think more deeply about violence in our culture. Jenkins says the educational significance and potential value of games is partly a consequence of their growing importance in young people's lives. It's time now to shift our attention to finding positive aspects of playing violent video games. As suggested by some researchers, violent video games may provide a beneficial platform for educational purposes. Christopher Ferguson has called for future research examining the advantages of video games as learning tools. He said it may be worth looking at ways in which these games may be used to promote educational benefits. Since the negative effects of violent video games on aggressive behavior may be overstated, Ferguson said these games may prove valuable as learning mechanisms. Let's now look at two examples where video games with violent content have been shown to have some educational advantages. In one impressive study from researcher Pamela Cato and her colleagues, they reported that one violent video game called Remission, a first-person shooter game, improved the quality of life, cancer knowledge, and greater commitment to treatment in teen and young adult cancer patients. In this game, players act as a microscopic female robot who is injected into the bodies of cancer patients and shoots cancer cells and infections with weapons. Ferguson argued this game, Remission, has promoted the health of young medical patients and provides positive prosocial behavior. This clearly is in contradiction to early studies that blasted all violent video games as harmful. Another popular video game involving multiplayers is World of Warcraft, which is a fantasy role-playing game that has violent content. In this game, players enter a fantasy universe in an action-packed adventure of exploration. Players interact with each other as allies and foes in a world involving conquest and battles. Some research studies by Constance Steinkuhler and several colleagues, including Sean Duncan, have suggested this video game may promote both writing and reading skills in its players through blogs and message boards. This video essay has reviewed a series of studies that looked for a clear and direct connection between violent video games and violent acts. Some early research found that playing video game increased aggressive-related thoughts and behavior, but video game violence exposure was never found to be a predictor of any serious acts of aggression or violence. Later research confirmed that violent video games could not be linked to causing criminal behavior or lethal violence. Playing violent video games cannot be singled out as a sole cause for mass shootings. Research needs to move forward to other possible risk factors of violence such as mental illness, particular personality traits, access to weapons, and adverse home conditions. As suggested by researcher Christopher Ferguson, this debate of blaming violent video games must end. It is time to consider the positive effects of violent video games through additional studies. Researchers such as Henry Jenkins and Pamela M. Cato are finding that some video games with violent content are providing educational and emotional support for today's youth. We need to continue to explore the positive benefits of video games and how they may be used and designed to promote educational agendas.